morning and welcome to the Festival of the Unexplained. I'm Jo, and as you can probably tell, I am very, very tired, but we're having a fantastic new day. We're having a fantastic weekend also. Yesterday saw the likes of Michael and Calves this morning. We had, I haven't slept yet, so it's a little bit difficult to kind of try and remember everybody. But we had some fantastic guests today and, yesterday, and today is going to be no disappointment either. We have got the creme de la creme of the paranormal world. We have Nick Roth today. We have Johnny Hauser from the Villisca Axe Murder House talking to us as well. But no further ado, I have been excited because I love stories and I love talking about all of the Pendle witches and everything else. And as the veil is thinning coming up to Halloween, I just feel that it's in keeping with the theme that we're trying to establish this weekend. Now, my next guest is the lovely Simon Entwistle. Now, I'm just going to bring him onto screen. So hello, Simon. How are you today?
Hello, Jo. Fine, thank you very much. Like you, I've just had a nice cup of coffee. So it's a good start to Sunday morning, Jo.
It is, and it's been quite wet this morning actually here in North Wales, but the sun seems to want to come out and be shining through the window, so that's nice as well.
Yes, yeah, we need a bit of sunshine, don't we, really?
We do. So, Simon, you run Top Hat Tours, don't you?
That's right, Jo. I'm the only employer. I started in 1996, and I started just with coach tours. And I've now branched out into not only coach tours, but ghost walks. I cover various halls in the north of England. And I also visit schools and universities for PowerPoint shows on storytelling, really. And that's what I love about my job. I've got thousands and thousands of stories up there. And through my work, I've met some lovely people, Jo.
Well, I'm really excited to listen to what you have. So I'm going to leave you to it. And I will be back in approximately an hour's time just to see what everybody's got to say. I'm not going anywhere. I am going to be right here. So take it away.
Thank you very much indeed, Jo. Well, a very, very good morning, folks. My name is Simon Entwistle, and I do run my own tourism business. I was absolutely delighted some 3 years ago to be invited to the City of London to receive a tourism award from what we call Visit England. And I got down to the Tower Bridge Museum and I met 12 other people who'd also been nominated for tourism awards from Visit England. I was very, very delighted, really chuffed, to be honest with you. After receiving the awards, we all had a chance to talk to each other. And I met a lovely lady called Rachel. Now, Rachel is a City of London tour guide, and she covers Jack the Ripper tours. I was familiar with the story, but not in such a great depth as Rachel. And she said, Simon, I'll take you on a guided tour, just the two of us. So we set off after the event and made our way into Whitechapel. At each of the murder scenes, Rachel brought out a photograph of the area from the 1880s, due to, of course, houses being demolished and the Luftwaffe's events in London in 1940. A lot of these areas have disappeared forever. The one thing Rachel did do was plant a seed in my head, because a lot of those photographs looked very, very like Clitheroe, Lancashire, cobbled streets, little ginnels, stickleways, and indeed those famous gas lamps that emanated in the Jack the Ripper stories. So I thought, okay, if Rachel can do it, I can do it as well. And I started my own tours in Clitheroe. Yes, Jack the Ripper tours, by bringing in all the characters and standing in various areas that look like Berners Street, that look like Mitre Square, that look like Hanbury Street, that look like Duckfield's Yard and Miller's Court. And I started doing them. I've done quite a few. And if you do go to my website, which is www.tophattours.co.uk, you will find a trip advisor link. And much to my joy, a lot of people that came on the Clitheroe Jack the Ripper tours have left some very, very pleasant remarks. So we're now going to turn the clock back in time. What a great way to spend a Sunday morning. Blood, gore and horror. But the Jack the Ripper story is up there with the Pendle Witches. It's one of the most famous stories in Great Britain. And I'm going to do my very, very best, just like Rachel, to bring it to your attention. Now, the area we know simply as Whitechapel was really called outcast London. It was a horrible place to live. Talk about squalor, talk about starvation, talk about deprivation, talk about unemployment. It was a horrible place to be. There were 90,000 people living in Whitechapel in 1888, in an area really designed for 30,000 at its maximum. To add to all this grief, 10,000 Jews arrived from Eastern Europe, from Romania, from Poland, from Russia, and they swelled these numbers once again. They weren't particularly well received because they were extremely good businessmen. They organized their own businesses and they would only employ their own people. So therefore, it added to a lot of tension. Now, the police absolutely hated Whitechapel. And when they did patrols, it's very, very likely they'd do it in fours because the violence there was unbelievable. Now, out of those 90,000 people, 2,000 were permanently left without a home, and they lived in what we call doss houses. For threepence, you could get a bed for the night, which sounds great, doesn't it, really? But in that bed, it'd be full of lice, bed bugs, and you'd wake up scratching and scratching and scratching. You wouldn't get a very good night's sleep, probably. For just a penny, you could actually hang over a line, yes, and sleep whilst you're standing up. Children, well, by the time you got to 5, 50% of all children at the age of 5 would have died of malnutrition due to the terrible, terrible, harsh conditions. One of the Central News journalists went into Whitechapel one day and saw a long line of women waiting at a workhouse, all naked, waiting to climb into a tin bath that had been used by at least 40 people before they even got there. He noticed on their backs lots of blood and he thought, have these women been tortured in some way? They hadn't been tortured. It was the bed bugs that had eaten into their flesh. So you can imagine, I painted the picture what Whitechapel looked like in the 1880s. Outcast London. However, Whitechapel was going to hit the front page of every newspaper in Great Britain due to a series of events that were committed by an absolute maniac. Some people admired this person. The Metropolitan Police, the City of London Police and Scotland Yard hated him with a vengeance because he always evaded capture. My impression of him is a bit like a Special Air Service trooper. He was a professional killer, but his victims were all going to suffer. Now, when I say victims, these poor women, God bless them, and I have nothing but the highest respect for each and every one of them, living in such squalor, the only thing that could take their minds off the horror of starvation and the conditions they were living in was a glass of gin. And a glass of gin would cost you 3 pence. And after 3 or 4 glasses, it would take you to a much more happier place. Remember, these poor women would have to service some very, very horrible characters and commit some terrible acts, which, of course, prostitutes have to do to this very, very day. So therefore, I have no hate for these women whatsoever. In fact, a lot of feelings for them, really, because they had no option. They were forced into this because of starvation, because of their love for alcohol, and indeed the conditions they were living in. So let's now start our story. And I'm going to show you a picture of Spitalfields. Now, Spitalfields Market is in the very, very centre of the Jack the Ripper story. Those people who were fortunate to work there would be slaughtermen, there'd be greengrocers, and it was a hive of activity. But if you didn't work, you didn't eat. So therefore, you had to work. You had to find some form of work just to survive. Let's have a look at a picture from the Spitalfields Market, which is right here. That gives you an idea of the squalor. It gives you an idea of the conditions, but it also gives you an idea of just how busy you had to be to keep yourself employed. So living in there, this Spitalfields Market is on the left-hand side. There's 90,000 people living in an area which is suitable for just 30,000 people. On the 4th of April, 1888, our first murder took place. It was the murder of a young girl of the name of Emma Smith. Emma was 27 years of age, and she'd been in the Spitalfields area, and the poor girl had been attacked. She was so badly injured she couldn't tell anyone who the person was, but this does sound very, very cruel. The poor girl had a knife inserted into her uterus, and the knife was twisted. She was bleeding very, very badly, and the pain she must have gone through was no one's business. She made her way to Spitalfields Hospital, where she died 3 days later. She was in so much pain from septicemia that she never recovered. She never opened her eyes again. Many people believe that she was indeed the first victim. So that was on the 4th of August, 1888. On the 7th of August, another woman called Martha Tabrin was found again behind Spitalfields Market with 80 stab wounds. Now, she had been seen drinking in a public house called the Britannia with 2 soldiers, 2 red-coated infantrymen, and they'd been drinking very heavily, and these boys probably wanted some servicing, if you will. They were arrested the following morning because the wounds looked like they'd been inflicted by a bayonet. But both men told the magistrates, "Sir, we are not allowed to carry weapons when we are off duty of any kind whatsoever." And both men were acquitted. So Emma Smith has had terrible stab wounds to her internal organs. Martha's been stabbed 80 times, but we now start with our very, very first so-called victim. She was called Polly Ann Nichols. Polly was 45 years of age. Her hair had turned from a lovely brown to a dark grey. She had a love for alcohol, and that was the only thing that kept her going, really. She had been married. She had 6 children, 4 of which had died before they reached maturity. And of all the bad luck, her husband had actually fallen in love with the midwife of her final child. And he'd thrown her out. She lived with her father for a while, but her father got rather tired of her drinking, and he threw her out as well. There was only one place to go to, outcast London, and she made her way into the famous Whitechapel area. She was seen before her death by another prostitute by the name of Emily Holland outside the Doss House near Bucks Row. And Emily said, "Are you all right there?" "Oh, yeah, I'm fine, thank you. I've got a lovely new bonnet to wear. I ain't got no money for me DOS money. I've been chucked out, but I'll go get some money and I'll find some money soon. I've got a lovely new bonnet to wear." She was never seen alive again. At around 3:40 in the morning, she'd been walking down Bucks Row, and someone with incredible speed had come out of the shadows and cut her throat left to right back to the vertebrae. And she'd slumped to the floor. He then committed some terrible acts by literally disemboweling the poor woman, but pulled her dress back down. He then disappeared into the shadows. A gentleman called Robert Cross, he worked at Spitalfields Market. He was a slaughterman. He came across the body and immediately alerted the police. PC Neil arrived at the H Division Metropolitan Police and looked at the body and thought, "Oh, another victim." Her corpse was then taken to the workhouse, where the following morning, Dr. Llewellyn, a local police surgeon, had the duty of conducting a post-mortem, an autopsy. As her clothing was removed, he was horrified to find that she'd been very, very badly mutilated. Whoever committed this terrible act must have been a very, very evil and aggressive person. There's no two ways about it. Word spread through Whitechapel that another murder had taken place, but this one really did hit the headlines. In Whitechapel at that period of time was a bit of a hero from the story. He was called George Lusk, and George Lusk was really the unofficial mayor of Whitechapel. He was a builder, a local lad. He kept himself employed, and a lot of people looked at him for some respect, really. And he'd complained to the police that no one gives a damn about us people living in Whitechapel. The place is run by by Jews and pimps. You do nothing for us whatsoever. And he made his feelings known, not only to the Metropolitan Police, but to the local news agency as well, the Central News Agency in London. And he formed what's called the Whitechapel Vigilante group. These were local men who joined him, and they would patrol the streets to try and find these people that were causing so much grief. And one person in particular was a Jewish gentleman named of John Pfizer. And he had been manipulating quite a few of these prostitutes. And they believe that he was behind these murders. He was also commonly known as Leather Apron. However, on the just a few days later, on the 9th of September, a lady of the name of Annie Chapman, her story is quite sad, really. Anne had started life very, very happily, really. Her husband had been a coachman at Windsor Castle, and she was a highly respectable woman, quite a clever young lady, but the children that she bore had been very, very badly deformed. And she had one child that was okay, but she had run away from home and she didn't know where she was. And this caused a lot of friction between her and her husband. They separated on the understanding that her husband would, in fact, give her 10 shillings a week. And this could be collected from the local post office at Spitalfields. For a while, she sold flowers and she did some crocheting. And then she moved in with a gentleman who made sieves. And for a while, she was known as Civvy. However, her love for alcohol won the day. She was seen at number 29 Hanbury Street by a lady called Elizabeth Long that September evening. She was seen standing outside 29 Hanbury Street with a gentleman with a deerstalker hat pulled quite down towards his forehead. And Elizabeth must have been quite an intelligent lady, because she was making her way to Spitalfields Market herself. And as she walked past, she heard the words, "Will you?" "Yes, I will." At the back of 29 Hanbury Street, they made their way into the backyard there. And what I find amazing about this murder is that the whole of Hanbury Street, there were literally 400 people crammed into houses there. The slightest sound would have been heard by anyone. A gentleman called John Kadesh, he was a local Jewish boy. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, he'd been sleeping very, very badly and had made 4 attempts to go to the outside latrine. Around 6:15, he made his way to the back door to relieve himself. There was a fence separating 29 from 28 Hanbury Street, and he heard a dull thud and thought nothing of it, went back inside. However, one of the occupants of 29 Hanbury Street, a gentleman called John Davis, went to the yard the following morning, and he saw a woman lying on her back with her intestines thrown over her right shoulder. He was deeply shocked, as you can imagine. Inspector Chandler of H Division Metropolitan Police was in the area and came rushing to the scene. He was absolutely horrified as he made his way into the backyard. He saw this woman lying flat on her back. As he looked up, he could see lots of people actually looking down from the houses above the 29 Hanbury Street, and people were actually charging people to come to their house to look out of the window to look at the body. It was quite amazing, really. Now then, Chandler was quite shocked. He saw blood spattered against the side of the fence. He saw those famous criss-cross cuts across the neck. At her feet, he saw a letter from an Essex infantry regiment, and in there were 2 pills. Now, Anne had been suffering from terrible lung disorders. She'd also been in a fight with a woman called Eliza in the 10 Bells public house over a bar of soap, and she was in a very bad state of health. In fact, many historians believe that had she survived this terrible event, she would have died very, very soon afterwards of terrible alcohol-related diseases. Her rings had been removed from her finger, and at her feet were 3 coins, 3 farthings, this letter with the 2 pills on the side there, a broken comb, which she must have used to comb her hair before she met her clients. But by the body was indeed a vase, if you will, almost like a vase type instrument, and in there was a leather apron. a leather apron. And of course, George Lusk was onto this right away, the vigilante, and he informed it's Pfizer. Pfizer's the man you want. Pfizer was arrested by the Metropolitan Police, and there he had alibis for every single murder and was released. Later on, he was going to sue the Metropolitan Police for false incrimination, and he was quite successful, but he was certainly scratched off the list. In the meantime, around Whitechapel, there's absolute hysteria, and George Lusk is getting very, very annoyed. The police have done nothing. That's when a most unusual letter arrived at the Central News Agency in London, and I shall read it for you right now, folks. It's gone down in history as the Dear Boss letter. When I say boss, it's been sent to the editor of the Central News Agency in red ink. Dear Boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I've laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I'm down on whores, and I shan't quit ripping them till I get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with it, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Ha ha. The next job I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so sharp, I want to get to work right away, if I get the chance. Good luck. Well, that letter was taken very, very seriously and got onto the front page of nearly every newspaper in Great Britain. Scotland Yard were informed, so was the Central News Agency, and indeed City of London Police and Metropolitan Police. Now, this really embarrassed them because this person committing these incredible acts was, as I mentioned before, like a special air service trooper. Fast, no sound heard at all at any of the murders. And you imagine committing murders in literally under the noses of thousands and thousands of people without being seen once. The man was almost practically invisible. Now, let's have a look at the officers in charge of this investigation. Sir Charles Warren, he was the commissioner, police commissioner. He had been a British Army officer, a very high-ranking officer. And the year before in Trafalgar Square, he had actually successfully stopped rioting there. And that's when he was appointed the police commissioner of the Met. A very tough man by all accounts, but the one thing he was good at was ordering troops around, but not civilians. And of course, the Metropolitan Police were indeed civilian officers. So therefore he got a bit frustrated, really. He had an assistant called Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson wasn't really interested. He had just 1 year left before he could retire. The chief inspector of the Metropolitan Police at that time was Donald Swanson, and he was very concerned because these murders were embarrassing him. George Lusk was on his back all the time. And beneath him, he had Inspector Thomas Arnold, Inspector Chandler, and indeed Inspector Edmund Reed. But the most famous detective in this was indeed Frederick Aberline. He was the lead detective. He had a sidekick called Sergeant Teak. Some people called him Sergeant Thick, but it was indeed Sergeant Teak. And these men were given the job of combing the whole area. Now, Frederick Aberline knew Whitechapel like the back of his hand, and he also knew all the public houses, and he would have come across a lot of these ladies of the night. He was no stranger to Whitechapel. What he couldn't understand, like somebody else, is how this person could evade being detected. So therefore, the police got quite a few gentlemen that looked a bit like women, and they put women's clothes on. They pretended to be these ladies of the night, but they couldn't bring him out of the shadows. For a good 2 weeks, nothing happened, but the tension in Whitechapel was quite right, if you will. This was all going to change on the 30th of September 1888, the night of the double murders. Elizabeth Stride. Now, she's our next victim. Elizabeth came from Gothenburg in Sweden. She was the only one of these ladies that lost their lives that was indeed a professional prostitute. She had contracted venereal diseases in Gothenburg, being cured, and she made her way to London. And she made her way down to the coast in Kent. And there she met a gentleman called John Stride. John Stride was a shipwright, and he married her. He was a lot older than Elizabeth, but he married her. When he became a bit too old to, shall I say, perform his duties, if you know what I mean, she left, and she made her way straight to the city of London. For a while, the Swedish church did show kindness towards her by giving her accommodation and food, but trying to convert her away from alcohol and trying to convert her away from her job to live a more Christian life. But Lizzie was having nothing to do with it. On 11 o'clock, outside a place called Dutfield's Yard, not too far from Bucksrow, our first murder, she was seen having an argument with a gentleman with a deerstalker hat, pulled down, a cape, sandy moustache. And this gentleman was called Israel Schwartz, another Jewish gentleman. And he crossed the road because he could see that quite a lot of confrontation was taking place, but he thought this place is getting a bit dangerous. He crossed the road to evade walking past them, but he did see there was quite a heated exchange of words. Half an hour later, a gentleman called Louis Dumschultz. Louis, again, another Romanian Jew. He'd been living in the city now for 5 years and started his own business, was doing extremely well. He was actually a diamond and gold expert. Wasn't just happy with buying and selling diamonds and gold. He also had a club. He opened his own club, not a public house, but a club exclusively for the local Jewish population. He came home, was about to go into Dutfield's Yard with his horse and trap, which would have been a BMW of the day, if you will. The horse suddenly reared as it got towards the entrance of Dutfield's Yard and wouldn't go any further. Louis climbed off the trap, and there in the dim light he saw a woman lying flat on her back. It was too dark, so he lit a match to look at her face and thought, "Is it me wife? Has she been drinking too much?" As the light of the match flickered in front of Lizzie's face, he realised it wasn't his wife and rushed into the club, and people came out with lanterns and saw that this woman had had her throat cut, but there was no mutilation to her body. It seems that Louis Dumschultz had somehow disturbed the murderer, and that's where the horse had sheared. The murderer must have slowly stepped back into the shadows and disappeared down into Goulston Street. Many historians believe that that night, Jack the Ripper, as we now know him, was really annoyed because he'd been stopped from committing his mutilation. His next victim is the one I feel very, very, very sorry for. A woman from Wolverhampton by the name of Catherine Eddowes. Catherine is 46 years old. She'd been married to a soldier, and that marriage petered out. She made her way down to the hop fields of Kent, and there she worked in the hop fields. But as winter came, of course, the hops stopped growing, and she made her way back to Whitechapel. Like all our victims, she loved a drink. And as I said before, the only thing that would take your mind off this horrible profession, and let's be honest, these girls wouldn't like it, they had no option, would be gin. She'd been drinking very heavily that day and had been seen quite near Spitalfields on the pavement, out for the count. The police picked her up and they took her to the local police station, where she was placed in a cell. And around 1 o'clock in the morning, the duty sergeant thought, she's all right now. Let's check her out. It'll shive us at breakfast anyway. She was thrown out on the streets, semi-drunk. Apparently, she left the police station singing to herself, and she made her way for the very, very first time from Whitechapel and into the city of London itself, a place called Mitre Square. Now, as I mentioned before, in London to this very, very day, you have Metropolitan Police, City of London Police, which would look after the very, very centre of the city itself. She made her way onto Mitre Square, which is the only area to this very day that hasn't really changed. There's some areas that are exactly the same as 1888. She made her way across Mitre Square and entered the City of London. Out of the darkness appeared PC John Kenyon of the City of London Police. His job was to patrol Mitre Square, and it took him 7 minutes to walk right round the square. He would pass the time by looking at the windows. There were night watchmen there as well, because the Mitre Square was actually full of warehouses as well, and there would be night watchmen there as well, so the area was still quite densely populated. As he made his way around Mitre Square, right behind his back, Jack the Ripper struck. He cut Catherine's neck side to side, lifted up her dress, removed her uterus, removed her kidney, removed the end of her nose, and stabbed her underneath the eyes as well. A terrible act of barbarism. Terrible act of barbarism. When the police officer came round, he was absolutely shocked to see this horrible, mutilated body in front of him, which had happened within earshot of his actual beat. He immediately shouted to the night watchman in the nearby warehouse, said, "Have you heard anything?" "No, nothing at all, mate, nothing at all." But Catherine had become the fourth victim. Now, this was a City of London crime, so for the very, very first time, the City of London police were involved. Major Henry Smith. Just like Charles Warren, he was ex-army, and he'd been dining in one of the exclusive restaurants in the City of London that night and arrived at the scene straight away. There he met PC Kenyon and PC Arnold of the City of London Police. And he said, right, let's look at the area. Let's look at the area. Just outside, literally a matter of feet, was a place called Goulston Street. And there, scratched on the wall, were the words, "The Jews are not the men that will be blamed for everything." The Jews, not Jews, but the Jews. It was in chalk lettering. And Major Henry Smith said, "We need to take a photograph of this," because beneath it was a piece of apron that had been taken off Catherine's body and used to wipe the blade on. It was right beneath the actual drawings. So Charles Warren arrived from the Metropolitan Police and told Major Henry Smith, no, let's have that rubbed away right away. "But sir, we need to take a photograph." No, if the locals see that, we'll have riots on our hands. Let's get rid of it." Major Henry Smith, the City of London Police, protested. But of course, he was outranked, and the actual graffiti was just inside the Whitechapel area, just inside. So therefore, no photograph was taken of the actual inscription. But PC Kenyon took his pad out and he wrote down exactly what he'd seen, and that's why we have a record of this. So it's the 30th of September. There's been 2 murders that have happened very, very close to each other. The whole of Whitechapel, the whole of the City of London is crawling with police officers. A ring of steel has been placed around Whitechapel, but somehow our murderer has got back into Whitechapel. He must have walked straight past the officers without causing any attention. Most amazing situation. So again, letters arrive at the Central News Agency, and this is what we call the Saucy Jack letter, really. At first it was dismissed as a load of rubbish, but it was then taken very seriously because it had been written by the same hand as the Dear Boss letter. Let's have a look at this. "I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed. A bit couldn't finish straight off. Had not time to get the ears off for the police. But thanks for keeping first letter back. Till you get work again. Jack the Ripper." Absolutely incredible. Well, a week passed. Another week passed. And another week passed. And things were slowly getting back to normal again. until George Lusk, he is indeed the head of the Vigilante organisation. He got a letter called The Letter from Hell. Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you to piece together. I fried and ate it. It was very nice. I might send you the bloody knife that took it out. You only wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me When You Can, Mr. Lusk. So even George Lusk was getting letters from this Jack the Ripper character. Well, our next murder is pretty horrible, really. Many people say it was the last one, but many people don't believe it was, really. This took place at Miller's Court. But before we go there, I'd just like to bring in three people from the Mitre Square area. William Harris, John Levander, and William Levi. They'd been on Mitre Square that night, and they'd been in a nearby public house. And as they'd walked across Mitre Square, John Levander noticed a man with a deerstalker hat, a cape, and a package wrapped in newspaper, quite a long package. And he said to his two friends, "This place is getting dangerous. Let's cross the other side of the square." These three were going to play a very, very big part in the later investigations. However, let's go to our so-called last victim, and she was called Mary Kelly. Now, Mary, God bless her, she was 25 years of age and came from Ireland. Out of all of our victims, she was by far the most attractive, but her story again was very, very sad. She'd come from Ireland with her mother and father and moved to South Wales. There she met a local lad who she loved very much indeed. He was a miner, and sadly he was going to lose his life in an underground explosion in South Wales. She was 19 years old at the time, and she left South Wales and made her way to the bright lights of London. At first, she got jobs in variety shows, etc. She had a lovely voice, a beautiful singing voice, but she then reverted to her love of alcohol, and she moved into number 7 Miller's Court. She was behind with her rent by quite a large amount, really, but she seemed to have a charm. Her landlord was a chap called John Boyer, and she said, "Don't worry, Mr. Boyer, I'll have your money ready for you next week. But you're at least 26 shillings behind, love." "Oh, don't worry, sir, I'll have your money for you next week." Now we're going to bring in another witness, a gentleman of the name of Hutchinson. And he is by far the most famous of all the witnesses. On that terrible, terrible night, the 9th of November, 1888, Hutchinson had been waiting very, very near 7 Miller's Court. Now, Mary was the only one of our victims that actually had accommodation of her own. It was a bedsit. And she'd bring her clients back, and of course they could conduct their acts in privacy and close the curtains. Hutchinson had no money that night, and he waited outside her apartment for her to arrive, and she arrived with what he described as a toff. Now remember, Elizabeth Long, Israel Schwartz, and indeed Levander, Harris and Levi had all mentioned a man with a deerstalker hat, and Elizabeth Long felt he could have been foreign. She thought it was a foreign accent. However, this man with Mary that night had a top hat. He had white spats on. He was described as a toff. Hutchinson hid in the shadows, and as they walked past him, he bent down to tie his shoe to look up into the face of this man. He said he was about 39, 40 years old, moustache with the ends curled up, a real toff. He had what looked like a bag with him, almost like the bag a doctor would take with them. He waited for half an hour for this man to leave, and then he was hoping that Mary would satisfy his desires. However, an hour passed and he thought, "That's it, I've had enough, I'm going." Had he stayed, he would have seen Jack the Ripper. The following morning, Mr. Boyer went to 7 Miller's Court. He was, of course, the landlord. You could see some broken glass in the window, and as he pulled back the curtain, he saw poor Mary on her bed. The poor woman had been practically skinned alive. There are photographs of this, which you can see on the internet. I have a book here by Inspector Rumbelow, but the picture is so horrific, I really can't show you it because it is just that horrific. Her heart had been removed, her breasts had been removed, and organs had been splattered all over the bedsit. He had used her clothes by throwing them into the fire to illuminate the room, and he had an absolute night of frenzy. And then, just like all the other murders, he disappeared into the shadows. Inspector Abilene arrived with Sergeant Teague, and they shook their heads in absolute desperation. They were nowhere nearer to catching this maniac, and the amount of abuse the Metropolitan Police got was incredible. They were the laughingstock of Great Britain, and this upset Abilene greatly. That's when, for the very, very first time, they brought in Scotland Yard. Not the Met, not the City of London, but Scotland Yard. And a gentleman called Mr. McNaughton, Inspector Charles McNaughton, a highly intelligent man. Now let's have a look at the suspects, which all came from our friend, Mr. McNaughton. First person, would you believe, was Sir William Gull, the Queen's surgeon. Sir William Gull, a highly respected gentleman. He was a bit older than the person that Hutchinson had seen that night, but would have worn the same clothes. Now, there was a conspiracy, it's just sheer speculation, that Leopold Prince Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, had been to Whitechapel and had been in the company of one or two of these ladies. It has been said, never denied or confirmed, although I do find this story hard to take in, that he fathered an illegitimate child, and that child was looked after by Polly Ann Nichols, Anne Chapman, Lizzie Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Kelly. And the four of them knew about this child. Sir William Gull, according to this idea, was quite shocked that if this news got out, it would really cause the royal family a lot of pain. So the theory is that he had all four of these women killed by bringing a coach into Whitechapel, enticing them into the coach, murdering them in the coach, and then dropping their bodies off at different areas. This would explain why there was no screaming heard and why there was no sound heard. But I personally do not believe this to be the case. I think Sir William Gull would have been too old, and the amount of cruelty committed by this person would not have been done by a man of his status. Montague Druitt. Now, he was Scotland Yard's #1 suspect because his body was found 4 weeks later in the River Thames. He'd been dragged from the river, and they believe that he'd been in since that November evening. He was a failed doctor. His father was an extremely good surgeon, and his father wanted him to follow him, but he'd failed all his medical exams, but would have had access to his father's professional equipment. And they believe that all the murders were committed by a mortuary knife, a very long knife that was very sharp and ideal for removing various organs. And Druitt would have had some idea of where kidneys were, where uteruses were, and of course where the heart was as well. And certainly the murders seemed to stop that night he took his life. Scotland Yard were convinced they got his man. Another suspect was called Dr. Donson. Now, he was into black magic. He was a toff, and it's said that he did use human flesh at some of his rituals. He would invite people to his London home, and there they would burn various pieces of human flesh. They were satanic black magic. However, he did in fact turn to Christ and became an eminent Christian. Therefore, he was struck off the list. Another suspect was Dr. Tumblety. Who was Dr. Tumblety? Well, he was an American doctor. And remember, Elizabeth Long felt this man sounded foreign. But he was overweight and couldn't really walk very, very fast. and he wouldn't know Whitechapel that well, really, but he was put on the suspects list because he'd been to one of the London hospitals and actually asked if he could buy some uteruses. Yes, I know it sounds horrible, but that's what he did. So therefore, it's a strange request, a very strange request. They did say that back in America, he would have various organs in jars, and he would show guests the various organs that were preserved in alcohol. But because of his age, I don't think he was indeed our ripper. We do know that Scotland Yard were on his tail, and he left London at great speed on parole and made his way to Paris, and then from Paris straight back to the USA. Some people believe that he may have been involved because where he was buried, they did actually have an autopsy in the 1950s, and they found rings in the coffin itself, rings that could have belonged to Annie Chapman, but there's no solid evidence. What we do know with the invention, or should I say discovery, of DNA, the Dear Boss letter was looked at, and someone said, hey, we've got DNA nowadays. We can look at the back of the stamp and we can trace it back for our records. They found DNA on the back of the Dear Boss letter, and it was indeed traced back to the postmistress at Spitalfields post office. Of course, she wasn't the ripper, but she would have actually probably seen him, and she would have actually licked that stamp and then posted it down the line. Another suspect is Robert Cross. Remember, he's the first person that saw Polly Ann Nichols and Bucks Row that August evening. And why was he up at that time of the day? They said that he was actually a slaughterman from the nearby Spitalfields market. He would start pretty early, but he would also have a very good sharp knife, and he would also know a little bit about killing pigs and things, removing organs from pigs. So therefore, this would have been quite easy meat for him. But again, he was classed as a suspect, but a very, very narrow margin, really. Aaron Kosminski, Polish Jew, knew Whitechapel very well. Like Robert Cross, he too worked at the markets in Spitalfields. He was a slaughterman. He had a hatred for women, a bit like Druids. Druid also hated women with a vengeance. And they say that Kosminski wasn't really of sound mind, a bit like a wild animal. Soon after the Margaret Kelly death, he was seen walking around Whitechapel, eating food that had been thrown in the gutter, and was then rushed straight to an asylum. Charles McNaughton looked at all of these suspects, and he had Aaron Kosminski taken from the mental asylum down to Brighton, to what's called the Seaside Rest Home, which was owned by the authority, the local police authority. He therefore brought in Elizabeth Long, Lavanda Harris and Levi, Israel Schwartz, and indeed Hutchinson. The four Jewish people, they weren't prepared to have an opinion, because apparently in the Jewish religion you are not allowed to incriminate a fellow Jew. Hutchinson said, well, the man I saw, sir, was a lot taller, had a twisted moustache, and this man is no gentleman, sir. Elizabeth Long, she also said that she only saw the back of the head. She said, can you ask him to talk? And he talked with a very strong Polish accent. It wasn't the same sort of more North American accent that Elizabeth had actually heard. So, to this very, very day, we don't know who the Ripper was. A lot of people feel that Aaron Kosminski was probably the prime suspect. But I believe whoever committed these murders was someone who suffered from terrible mental illness, had an incredible fitness level to get from one area to another. And I believe he must have worn some form of rubber shoe, because there was never any sound heard. No sound whatsoever. In 1955, in the city of Liverpool, in Toxteth, Liverpool, up in one of the attics, a diary was found, owned by a chap called Mr. James Maybrick. And James Maybrick was a very, very wealthy textile baron. He was also a drug addict. and a bit of a toff. He would wear a cravat, top hat, and he would go down from Lime Street, Liverpool, down to the City of London. And he was in the city every single time there was indeed a murder. And yes, he had visited Whitechapel on many occasions. When the diary was found, it gave a complete precise timing for all the murders. And indeed, it was extremely accurate. Of course, when ripperologists, as they call themselves, looked at the diary, they were amazed. It's James Maybrick. He came from Liverpool. He'd have had a different accent. However, they looked at the diary and they looked at the paper, and the paper was all made after 1935. So therefore, it could not have been from the 1880s. A most amazing story. As for my friend Rachel, who does the guiding tours, Jack the Ripper tours on a regular basis, she had a theory which I believe could be true. Every time a murder took place in the City of London docks, a German vessel arrived called the Seraph, a German vessel. And of course, the sailors would frequent Whitechapel. They'd have a good drink. And of course, like most sailors, they'd take advantage of the young ladies and who were prepared to sell their bodies. And they soon after the murders in South America, there was some very, very similar murders that took place where this vessel, the Seraph, had arrived. However, ripperologists have tried to trace the record to the ship's company, and there's no record whatsoever of the Seraph. So who was Jack the Ripper? We shall never know, folks. What I can tell you is he highlighted the horrors of Whitechapel, and as a result, houses were demolished afterwards. Living standards were improved, and the one thing Jack the Ripper had done was highlighted the poverty and deprivation of those poor people from outcast London in 1888. And there we have our Jack the Ripper story, folks. Are you still there, Jolene?
I am. That was amazing, wasn't it? And, you know, all the comments that we've had have been absolutely fantastic. You know, mesmerized is all I can say. Is, you know, another master of storytelling is what somebody's wrote. People keep saying that we've been spoiled by the stories that we've had on the festival over the weekend. So thank you so much. Now, where can they find you? I know that you've got somebody on your Facebook and they're putting all of the tours on there. So those comments will still stay on there. Have you got anything coming up which people can book on?
Well, Jolene, COVID has absolutely devastated my business. In fact, 2020 has been a horrible year, not just for myself, of course, but everyone involved in tourism and the entertainment industry. Through contacting my local authority, I can conduct 2 tours on Halloween, but only for groups of 30 people. That's 30 people, all socially distanced. I've also received permission to conduct tours at Samlesbury Hall. Samlesbury Hall is a beautiful 1322 building near Preston, and I'm going back there on the 1st of November. By just going to the Samlesbury Hall website, you can book onto one of those tours. I'm hoping and praying, Jolene, that they can get a vaccine for this terrible disease, because it has had a devastating effect on tours all over Great Britain. Yeah,
and like yourself, we're also feeling that, because we've had our events cancelled as well, hence why we've done this. But what I've loved to see actually in the comments is Stephen Mercer, who is the Victorian ghost hunter. He's actually commented, you know, excellent, Simon. Thank you for telling your Jack the Ripper story. Fantastic. So that is so lovely that the both of you do more or less exactly the same thing, but you have such a mutual respect for each other. And both of you have both suffered throughout COVID. And I just hope, you know, that you are able to conduct these tours in October for Halloween. And if there are any spaces, guys, get booked on, because, you know, Halloween's fast approaching. And, you know, we just want to get the money back into the tourism industry as well. But I just want to say thank you so much, Simon, for telling your Jack the Ripper story, and also for being part of the festival this weekend. We know it takes a lot of time from people's schedules to come on and talk to us. So I just wish to thank you, and we're very appreciative of it.
It's been a great pleasure to be invited, Jolene, and it's been quite a nice way to spend a Sunday morning. Thank you very much indeed. Also, if Steve's watching, I'm a huge fan of Steve, and I love his Victorian tour on the trams down in Blackpool. And of course, Blackpool is a treasure trove of stories, and Steve brings them to life beautifully. So I'm quite glad that Steve should watch as well. Thank you.
So lovely to hear that as well. So it's but yeah, so guys, keep on watching. We have the beautiful Miranda Young next from Ghost Biker Explorations. Now, this is one not to be missed. Miranda isn't very well known here in the UK. However, she does her tours on her Harley Davidson over in the US, and she goes into these haunted locations on her own. So these are investigations that have been filmed, and you will be able to watch them. But stay tuned. John and I are going to be interviewing her quite shortly.